cash flows from financing activities, and this is the first module on this topic. We have discussed in some of the past modules where we talked about the cash flow statement that there are three components of a cash flow statement. The first one is the operating activities, where we see the cash inflow and outflow which is related to operations. And then we have cash flow from investing activities, where we consider the cash inflows and cash outflows related to investments. There we consider the fixed assets other than the current assets and current liabilities, and also the profit and loss account. And the third part of a cash flow statement is the calculation of cash flows related to financing activity. पहले ये जानना ज़रूरी है कि फाइनेंसिंग एक्टिविटी से मुराद क्या है. फाइनेंसिंग से मुराद है सोर्सेज ऑफ फंड्स, यानी किसी बिजनेस के लिए, किसी कंपनी के लिए पैसा, फंड्स, फाइनेंसेस कहाँ से आते हैं. What are the sources? So we say that there are two external sources of financing. The first one is equity, यानी shares को issue करने से. And the second one is debt, यानी loan लेने से या bonds issue करने से. The third source of financing is termed as the internal source of financing, which is the profit earned by the company. तो जो प्रॉफिट कंपनी अर्न करती है या बिजनेस अर्न करता है, उसे तो हम पहले पोर्शन यानी ऑपरेटिंग एक्टिविटीज में कंसिडर कर लेते हैं. सो इन द फाइनेंसिंग एक्टिविटीज वी आर ओनली लेफ्ट विद द कैश फ्लोज विच आर रिलेटेड टू equity financing and debt financing. One basic thing that we should know is that whenever we get a financing, there will always be a cash inflow. And whenever we will return a part of that financing, that will be a cash outflow. यानी अगर एक बिजनेस कुछ लोन लेता है, तो लोन के लेने की वजह से उसे पैसा मिलेगा एंड दैट वुड रिजल्ट इनटू कैश इनफ्लो. और अगर वो उस लोन को वापस कर देगा तो उससे उसके पास से पैसा चला जाएगा एंड दैट विल बी अ कैश आउटफ्लो. सो टू कैलकुलेट द net value of cash inflow and outflow from financing activities, we need to consider all the elements which are part of our equity and part of our debt. While considering the debt, we consider the long-term debt as well as the short-term debt, but we do not consider the elements of working capital, that is, the accrued expenses or the accounts payable. So, whenever we are talking about the cash outflow as the return on this financing, that is something which is also included in this financing activity. यानी अगर हम equity generate करते हैं by issuing shares, तो उन शेयर होल्डर्स को हम रिटर्न के तौर पर डिविडेंड पे करते हैं, which is also to be considered. और इसी तरीके से जब हम लोन लेते हैं या बॉन्ड्स इशू करते हैं और उसके ऊपर जो रिटर्न हम लेते हैं उसको इंटरेस्ट का नाम दिया जाता है. लेट्स हैव अ लुक इन कैश फ्लो फ्रॉम फाइनेंसिंग एक्टिविटीज. द फर्स्ट पार्ट ऑफ डिस्कशन इज रिलेटेड टू equity financing. And equity financing means the financing generated from the issue of shares. We can issue common shares or preferred shares, and whenever we issue shares, there is an inflow of cash. Common shares are those which are never redeemable or never convertible. यानी जब एक दफ़ा कॉमन शेयर्स इशू किए जाते हैं तो जब तक कंपनी ऑपरेशनल है उस वक्त तक कॉमन शेयर्स को कैंसिल नहीं किया जा सकता. बट ऑन द अदर हैंड प्रेफर्ड शेयर्स कैन बी रिडीमेबल और कन्वर्टेबल. यानी प्रेफर्ड शेयर्स को इशू करने से कैश इनफ्लो हो सकती है और प्रेफर्ड शेयर्स को रिटर्न करने से कैश आउटफ्लो भी हमारे पास हो सकती है. Additional capital refers to the share premium. यानी अगर कोई कंपनी अपने शेयर्स को उनकी पार वैल्यू से ज़्यादा पे इशू करती है तो जो एडिशनल अमाउंट ऑफ कैश रिसीव होता है दैट इज रिकॉर्डेड एज शेयर प्रीमियम और एडिशनल कैपिटल. सो having additional capital is also an inflow of cash. Treasury stock means the stocks or the shares of the company repurchased by itself. Here it is very important to remember that treasury stock does not mean cancelling the shares by purchasing them. Treasury stock shares remain as the issued, subscribed and paid up shares. जब भी कोई कंपनी ट्रेजरी स्टॉक खरीदेगी तो उसके रिजल्ट में कैश आउटफ्लो होगी और जब उस ट्रेजरी स्टॉक को वापस मार्केट में सेल कर देगी तो उससे इनफ्लो ऑफ कैश जनरेट होगी. When a company pays dividend, that is distributes profit among its shareholders, that is what is called dividend, and dividend results into a cash outflow. Retained earning is actually the profit which is retained in the company. So we would see that the portion of retained earnings which has increased because of the current profit should not be considered in the financing activities because that amount of profit is taken in the operating activities. And the last part of the equity is reserves. Again, reserves are nothing but the appropriation of profit. अगर हम प्रॉफिट को किसी खास मकसद के लिए रिटेन करते हैं so that is termed as reserves, which can be general or specific reserves, statutory reserves and likewise. So हमें इस फाइनेंसिंग एक्टिविटीज के अंदर इक्विटी फाइनेंसिंग में ये देखना है कि वो कौन से अकाउंट्स हैं जिससे कैश इनफ्लो या आउटफ्लो होती है और कौन से अकाउंट से कैश इनफ्लो और आउटफ्लो नहीं होती है. Now let's see in the next slide that what are the sources or applications of cash, यानी cash inflows और outflows कौन सी हैं जो debt के साथ relate करती हैं. And here we are not referring to the long-term debts only but also the short-term debts. और यहाँ पर ये बात फिर याद रखने की ज़रूरत है कि यहाँ पर हम spontaneous financing यानी उन करंट लायबिलिटीज का जिक्र नहीं कर रहे कि जो हमारे ऑपरेशंस की वजह से अराइज होती हैं. दैट इज अकाउंट्स पेबल्स और एक्रूड एक्सपेंसेस. सो हियर वी इंक्लूड शॉर्ट टर्म बोरिंग यानी वो बोरिंग वो लोन्स जो एक साल से कम मुद्दत के हैं. Whenever we do that borrowing, it will result into a cash inflow. Whenever we return it, it will be an outflow. Same is the case with long-term borrowings. When we actually do the calculations, some part of the long-term borrowing is transferred to the short-term or current portion of that long-term liability. So one should see that while calculating the amount of inflow or outflow, that whether the difference or decrease in the value of long-term debt is due to the transfer in the current portion or is due to the payment. Only the payment amount should be considered as an outflow. Similarly, the bonds, which are actually a type of debt financing issued to the general public. So whenever bonds are issued, cash inflow is resulted. Whenever bonds are retired, the money is paid back to the bondholders and that results into cash outflow. And that current portion of long-term debt or liability is generally what is paid in the current year, and so that change in the amount is also reflected in the cash outflow. And the last thing is that if there are some lease payments, because lease financing is also a part of the financing of a business organization, and anything that we pay against the lease amount is also to be considered as a cash outflow. So the debt financing activities would result into cash inflow as well as cash outflows.